So this is our Simondon reading group coming back after a couple weeks break. My notes from last time say that we're starting on page 163 of the PDF. I hope that's correct, but I'm pretty sure it is. So we're still on part 4. We're at the section break between sections B and C of part 4. So C, I think, is fairly long. He's going to talk about technical invention, like the specific form of technical invention. So this next part is more connected with his other book on the mode of existence of technical objects that we read a couple years ago now, actually. It's been a while. So what we looked at the last couple of sessions before our break in part B was what Simondon calls formalization. So he gives out various different types of formalization. So this has to do with the way that some sort of implicit knowledge or implicit grasp of a situation, of the properties of an object, what you can do with an object, etc. This sort of implicit grasp of all this gets turned into something explicit. And so like a sort of one of the key instances of this is when some task is supposed to be performed by slaves or servants or some other subordinated person. If you are trying to get your subordinate to perform a task, you have to actually state explicitly what it is you want them to perform. You can't just sort of rely on this implicit knowledge. If you're performing a task yourself, you can just sort of know what to do in this implicit way. But then when you tell someone else, okay, do this for me, you have to actually explicitly tell them, how to hold the tool or what sort of movement they have to make or whatever. All the everything that was implicit before has to become explicit, or at least a large part of it. So this is an instance of formalization in the sense that the knowledge is now becoming explicit as opposed to implicit. So this is a sort of a step towards invention, because now that once this knowledge becomes formalized or explicit, then you can sort of operate on it in a way that you couldn't before. So something that is implicit knowledge is a sort of bodily skill. So something like you can think of tying your shoes or riding a bicycle or whatever, these sort of complex movements that we know how to do. But if you had to explain to someone what precise movements of your fingers you had to do to tie your shoes, like I would have no idea how to do that. So once you do formalize some sort of knowledge of how to perform an operation, you can sort of operate on that formalized knowledge. It becomes that knowledge becomes something, a sort of object in its own right. So you can take that knowledge and you can see, okay, what would happen if instead of doing operation A, we did operation B, while performing this complex series of operations. Maybe if you substitute B for A, you get a slightly different result. Maybe it's a little bit better, or maybe it gives something that works better in a certain situation or something like that. So you can, by operating on your formalized knowledge, your explicit knowledge, you now have a capacity to modify your set of operations, and this is a kind of invention. Even if it's to start with, it might be a very limited form of invention. It's just a sort of a slight modification. But the more of this formalized knowledge that you have available to you, the more you can sort of plug these pieces of knowledge into each other and then produce something new. So Simondon talks about the invention of the airplane, so this sort of the production of a flying device is something that human beings in various civilizations have sort of been interested in, and there were attempts to produce these types of things, but it's only once you had knowledge of internal combustion engines, for example, knowledge of metallurgy, also some sort of basic knowledge of aerodynamics. All these things have to come together before you can build an actual airplane. So having all this formalized knowledge available is sort of a prerequisite to building an airplane, and it explains why the Wright brothers succeeded in the late 19th century, whereas earlier attempts had failed. This kind of invention is made possible by the formalization of knowledge, and so it's it relies on the fact that this knowledge is now explicit instead of implicit. And then so he also talks about what he calls subjective formalization. So this is formalization in the domains of the normative and the artistic. So he talks about how you have norms in some societies, you have, or actually in all societies, there are some norms that are not sort of explicitly stated. You have some sort of notion of what is appropriate for particular situations. And often, so one of the examples that he talks about is the sort of separation of different moments in the course of a year, for example, in terms of various celebrations. So you have like a harvest festival, a New Year festival, I don't know, maybe a midwinter festival. Some different moments of the year have these sort of consecration ceremonies where you sort of mark the passage of a moment of the year, and so this form of separation of a sort of key point of the year, or of a passage of a portion of the year, is a kind of formalization, as Simon Don describes it. So it's a way of sort of separating out different aspects of the year. So the activities that belong to the harvest season are now sort of marked off from the activities that belong to, I don't know, the post-harvest season. I don't know, marketing your crops or whatever. So instead of having sort of all activities being kind of implicitly related to each other, now we have this sort of explicit junction point between one set of activities and another set of activities. So we have this formal mark of when activity type A ends and when activity type B begins, and so he calls this a kind of religious formalization. And so we can think of religious ceremonies in the sort of strict sense of the term, so things like baptism, First Communion, and all these types of ceremonies. But he also has in mind any type of ceremony that marks a change of state for a person in our society. So many of these are not explicitly religious in our society, but things like a graduation ceremony from school, retirement parties in the workplace, for example. So these mark moments of transition, and they sort of put an end to one kind of activity and initiate another kind of activity. And so these are sort of formal in the sense that they delineate different aspects of life from each other. And so this is a kind of formalization in the normative sphere. And then in the artistic sphere as well, there's so formalization here would be, again, a kind of separation, whereas in many societies, or probably all societies, you have decoration of sort of everyday life things. We paint the walls of our house a color that we find pleasing. We have some sort of ornamentation on our utensils or implements that we use every day. So probably all societies have something more than just purely utilitarian equipment that they put to use. But then at some point in certain societies, probably not all societies, there's a kind of separation of the artistic aspect from the use aspect. So you get to produce objects that are not meant to be used in everyday life, but they're meant to produce an aesthetic effect of some kind, independent of their properties as useful to perform a certain task. And so these are what we recognize as art objects, paintings, sculptures, musical performances, etc. So all of these objects are, again, sort of separated out from everyday life, and they mark a certain portion of the world in space and time as being a sort of special importance or special value to life. And I don't think Simon Don talks about this, but of course there's a high degree of connection between the religious formalization and the artistic formalization. Like religious ceremonies often involve music. The buildings in which religious ceremonies are performed, temples, churches, etc., are often very elaborate, decorated buildings. Or even if they are not decorated, it's they're plain. That plainness is meant to have an aesthetic effect as well. So there's a sort of aesthetics of religious ceremonies, and then conversely, there's to some extent, at least, kind of religion of aesthetics as well. So you don't consume or appreciate art objects just in any circumstance, but you make a special excursion to a museum, for example, to see paintings. So this is a kind of quasi ceremony. You don't just sort of appreciate art objects in any condition or at any time. You have to sort of set aside a kind of moment of time to appreciate art objects. And likewise, you wouldn't have a concert. I don't know, in the middle of a subway platform. Or at least this kind of concert wouldn't have the same kind of effect as attending a concert hall and appreciating the concert for itself. So again, these aesthetic performances are surrounded with a kind of ritual that makes us, or that is intended to make us appreciate them as sort of special moments, as opposed to just everyday moments. So this is the sort of the notion of formalization in the normative and aesthetic spheres or artistic spheres. And then, next we'll turn to invention. I think he's going to talk about all of those kinds of formalization and how they relate to invention. But he's going to focus on technical invention. So inventing technical objects and what that looks like. Okay, so that's, I think, good for the recap. If I can get someone to read from the top of section C up to the beginning of the subsection 1.
I can read. C, invention as the production of a created object or of a work. The process of invention may be formalized more comprehensively when it produces a detachable object or a work independent from the subject that is transmissible, that can be communalized, and that constitutes the basis of a relation of cumulative participation. Without wishing to negate the theoretical possibility or actual existence of cultures within certain animal species, we should note that the main limit of these cultures devolves from the paucity of means of successive transmission, the lack of an object that is constituted as detachable from the living beings that produced it, yet interpretable by other beings that reuse it by taking the results of the terminal effort of their predecessors as a starting point. In other words, it is not so much the capacity of organizing spontaneity that animal societies lack, but the power to create objects, if by creation we mean the constitution of a thing that can exist and have meaning in a way that is independent from the living activity that made it. The creation of objects enables progress, which is a web of inventions, one resting on another, with the latest subsuming the earliest. The organization of a nest or a territory vanishes with the couple or group that formed it. It is, at least in the most elementary organic forms, that the preservation of the object created or secreted by previous generations is the most effective as an organized support for later generations, coral, forest humus, etc. These effects of cumulative causality resurface after that in a clear and decisive way, only within the human species in the form of created objects that have a meaning for a culture. There is no guaranteed progress so long as culture, on the one hand, and the production of objects, on the other, remain independent of each other. The created object is precisely an element of organized reality that is detachable because it was produced according to a code belonging to a culture, enabling it to be used far from the time and place of its creation. The character of universality and timelessness of the created object may disclose itself in varying degrees, since cultures vary across societies. Every object and every work have, in a given era, a limited horizon of diffusion. However, there exists in the created object a virtual universality and eternity corresponding to the inner feeling of the creating subject who thinks he is producing a tema si in the terms of Thucydides, or declares like the Latin poet, non omnis moriar, I will not entirely die. This virtuality consists in a permanent possibility of reincorporation in other works or in subsequent creations in the form of a schema or component, even if the individuality of the created object is not preserved across successive inventions. The process of creation of objects emerges in various domains, yet it is particularly clear, at least in our societies, in the domain of techniques and in that of the arts. This is very interesting. This idea that the invention is something that enables this kind of transhistorical cultural transmission. It seems like in the idea that these objects they have a virtual universality and eternity. Simondon is thinking of them as being like the crystal germ, which never really completes its individuation through the milieu because it just is stopped at some point, but could in principle always be reinserted into another milieu through which it would propagate again. So this is an interesting suggestion that artistic and technical inventions have this same virtual eternity. I think we talked about this a couple sessions ago, but in the conclusion to Individuation Volume 1, Simondon talks about repetition, ethical repetition, as being potentially non-historically simultaneous. And so maybe one way we could think about this using this paragraph is you could think of it in terms of technical objects, but I think you could also think of it in terms of like a poem, for instance, which has a life that can extend far beyond the organic life of the poet or the artist who created it, and can be picked up again to affect a kind of co-presence much later after its creation.
Yeah, I think like one of the sort of stock examples we can take of this is the Homeric poems that were written, or probably weren't even written. They were probably oral productions originally, but were composed at some point probably around 800 BC, but or possibly a bit earlier than that. But they have been rediscovered many times since then, and have like you can think of the way that Virgil, for example, sort of rediscovers Homer or reinvents Homer, and in a lot of ways is imitating the Homeric form, but of course innovates because he's writing in Latin instead of Greek, and the way that successive generations have rediscovered Homer and have found something new or created something new on basis of Homer's works. And you can think of like the huge difference in what sort of society the Homeric poems were written in a society of pastoralists, sort of quasi-feudal organization, completely different society than say the Roman Empire, and then Renaissance Italy, for example, and then of course today. These are all very different societies, but the Homeric poems still have a kind of resonance that persists across all these different societies. And so I think you're right to point to that crystal idea, but also in a sense it's a different kind of persistence than in the case of the crystal. The crystal, once it's inserted into a specific milieu, it just produces the same kind of crystal again. So you can take a crystal and it might sit inert underground for 1,000, 1,000,000 years, whatever, and then once it's inserted into a solution, it will start crystallizing again. But it still produces the same kind of crystal. Whereas these artistic, productions, they get inserted into new environments and then produce something new. Virgil encountering Homer produces the Aeneid, whereas Shakespeare encountering Greek arts, Greek literature produces something completely different. So yeah, different societies will encounter these objects in different ways and will use them in different ways and discover new aspects of the work that were maybe not evident before, and sort of produce a new form, a new way of understanding the Homeric poems based on a new social arrangement. And it's also interesting to look at like the first bit of this passage that we just read, the contrast that he makes between conservation in animal societies and conservation in human society. So he suggests that, and we can probably connect this again with that contrast between the crystal kind of conservation and the conservation of an artistic work. So he talks about like corals, for example. So there is a kind of persistence of the product in the case of corals. You know, they form this sort of complicated reef structure, and then the next generation grows up on the reef that its ancestors produced. So there's a kind of inheritance, you could say, of this work that the corals have produced. But at the same time, it's a kind of it's the inheritance doesn't involve any sort of creative re-uptake of the later generation of what came before. So the coral that grows on the reef is just sort of inheriting the reef as a physical structure that it can construct its own sort of structure upon. It doesn't sort of reinterpret or grasp in a new way or invent really anything new in relation to the existing reef. Whereas, of course, in human societies, when we take up an artistic work from a previous civilization, we always have to reinterpret it and reinvent the understanding of that work, and that act of grasping the work of even the previous generation, or authors from a few years ago, even we're always creatively interpreting what we inherit from them. So Simondon suggests that the sort of more crystalline kind of inheritance, this kind of direct physical inheritance, is characteristic of what he describes as the lower organisms. So things like corals. And then he says that in the sort of other organisms, this kind of inheritance more or less disappears. So like when you look at mammals, they produce a burrow, for example, but then or the organization of a territory with lines for like a path towards the water, a path to escape, etc. But all this organization of the territory more or less disappears once the organism dies. So there's much more limited inheritance of a work in say most mammals, and then it's only in the case of humans that this sort of inheritance of the work reappears, but at a kind of higher level, in the sense that it's a creative inheritance, it's a kind of active inheritance, as opposed to just a passive sort of accumulation of the new generation on the product of the old generation. So we have the sort of schema of like this passive accumulation of the products of one generation, being inherited by the next, and then at a higher stage you have a lower, less of an inheritance. More the product sort of disappears with each generation, and then at a higher stage, in the case of humans, you end up with an active inheritance. So you always reinterpret something that comes that came before. Yeah, and so this is a relevant quote here that Angus has put in the chat from Deleuze's Nietzsche book. So it's the way that philosophers, in taking up the history of philosophy, they sort of reanimate philosophical texts from the past. They don't just sort of passively receive an inheritance of concepts or theories or whatever. They have to sort of go back into the past and actively and creatively interpret what they've received from previous authors and put them to new uses, or new understandings.
I wonder what it is for Simondon that distinguishes what is the boundary between humans and non-human animals that allows for this kind of taking back up of inventions by future generations. He says that it's animal societies lack the power to create objects. If by creation we mean the constitution of a thing that can exist and have a meaning in a way that is independent from the living activity that made it. So, like, obviously, a nest can still exist after it's left behind, but I guess it wouldn't have a meaning for another animal that came across it, or it wouldn't have a meaning as something that is to be passed down.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I'm glad you pointed that part out because it is a bit tricky or subtle, I think, to understand what he's getting at here. But yeah, so the nest, when it's in use, when if we're talking about a bird nest, for example, when the birds are, sorry, 1 second, sorry, had to sneeze. Yeah, when the birds are, raising their chicks in a nest, the nest has a certain valence in the world of those birds. It's like the home base that you orient your behavior towards. So it has a meaning in that sense. But then when the birds die, the nest is really just a bundle of sticks, or this weird bowl-shaped collection of sticks or whatever. It doesn't have any particular meaning. In some instances, some animals will reuse the nests of other animals, or you have, like, for example, cuckoos that will lay their eggs in the nest of other birds. So in this case, there is some sort of meaning of or valence of the object that is sort of passed on from one generation to the next. But in general, the object that is produced, the product of the activity of the animal, only makes sense or only has a value in connection with that animal's activity. And then so once the animal dies or moves away or whatever, that object, the product of the animal's activity, just becomes a sort of physical object that can decay or that doesn't really have any meaning to it. Yeah, so I wonder, I mean, there are instances, and yeah, maybe in connection with this, we can think of the way that animals do transmit culture. So there's been a fair amount of research over the last few decades in looking at cultural transmission. For example, birdsong. Birds learn, or at least many species of songbirds learn their song by listening to adults. And this means that there are, like, local dialects of the song. So the birds in one region have a slightly different song than the birds in a different region because they each learn from the birds in their environment, and so they pass down all the slight variations in the structure of the song. And then whales, for example, or dolphins, their sort of patterns of communication are also cultural, in the sense that there's regional variation that's inherited from one generation to the next. But in each of these cases, what's inherited is not a product that is independent of the life of the organism that produces it. What's inherited is a kind of pattern of activity that is intrinsically connected with the life of the organism that produces it. You might, maybe an exception to this might be the case of social insects. You have ants and termites, for example, and bees that produce a elaborate structure like a beehive or a termite nest. They produce this work that exists independently of any individual ant or individual termite. Many of those ants and termites will die over the course of a year or a few years, whereas the colony as a whole will survive and continue to sort of invest that structure with meaning. So the individual ant dies, but the ant colony as a whole continues to use the nest and to treat it as a home. So the structure still has meaning in that sense, and so later later generations or later the ants that are born later inherit this existing nest, this existing structure that has meaning. And so we can look at, potentially in the case of some of these social insects, it might make sense to treat the whole colony as an individual, as opposed to the uh, you know biologically separate individual ant as an individual. And we saw in individuation that he has a long discussion of different organisms, corals, for example, that exist in colony forms and then have an individual phase in reproduction. And some of the difficult decisions or difficult how difficult it can be in certain cases to decide what the actual individual is. Is it the one coral organism, or is it the whole set of corals that share a digestive system? To some extent, it's an arbitrary decision as to which one you want to treat as the individual. But yeah, so in the case of social insects, you might say that the whole ant colony or the whole beehive is the actual individual. And so in this case, again, you would have each generation. So like the hive, a generation of a hive would be like the hive splits. For example, once its population grows too much, a section of the bees will split off and they form a swarm, and then they find a new place to build a new hive. So that would be the kind of reproduction of the hive, and the formation of a new generation. And so in this case, again, the new hive doesn't inherit a structure with meaning from the earlier hive. It only inherits a kind of pattern of activity that is connected to the life of the organism. It doesn't inherit something separate from the life of the organism. But yeah, I think it's probably harder to make some of these distinctions than Simondon lets on. Partly, we just know more about inheritance in various organisms today than was known in the 60s. And then maybe Simondon is oversimplifying things a little bit, even given the state of knowledge in the 60s. But it's probably more complicated than Simondon lets on. But it does seem like there is like this distinction between a sort of passive accumulation of the products of one generation by the next, and then a kind of active revitalization or reinstituting meaning in something that already has a meaning. I think that distinction is probably still a useful one to make, even if it might not be as straightforward as Simondon was letting on. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. Let's see. Yeah, if I can get someone to read a page or so of the next subsection.
Here, I can read. I think I'm in the right place. The creation of technical objects, correct?
Yes, that's where we are.
Okay. The continuity of what is created, with its double dimension of spatial universality and temporal eternity, emerges clearly only if we abstract from the destination of usefulness of technical object. A definition by utility through the category of needs is inadequate and inessential, since it draws attention to that through which such objects are prostheses of the human organism. Yet it is precisely from this angle that universality and atemporality are the most directly impeded, for everything that adapts to the human being runs the risk of becoming a means of display or manifestation and being recruited as supplemental appendage. A large number of technical objects are dressed up as objects of display, with local and fugitive meanings piling on them, overriding their technical content, dissimulating it, and at times imposing distortions on it. If we take the object of the so-called touring car, although this word means little in the context of most present uses, we find several layers ranging from the object of display, exterior, to the almost purely created technical object, in the scarcely visible or unknown parts for the majority of users, gears, transmission, or generator. The intermediary layer of reality, half technics and half language, is also that of partially visible and describable organs, such as the engine, which announces its cylinder capacity, its compression rate, the number of speeds, and the solutions used for accessory circuits, such as oil filter. There was the era of the long engine with a large number of cylinders in a line, then the V engine and others in flat twin designs, recently the slanted engine, not to mention the frequent incorporation in Italy of the cylinder volume in the denomination of the model or series. Variations on the external layer are all at once infinite in number, and rather limited. They are infinite because they are continuous, without the necessary gaps imposed by the state of things. All hues and all alterations of shape are possible, as in the domain of clothing. However, these alterations are limited by their compatibility with use. In the same way, clothing is limited by the shape of the body, the necessity of allowing a relative freedom of movements and of preserving a minimal usefulness. If there is creation in the external layer of display, it is akin to the invention of a compatibility between the touring automobile and other technical products. For instance, the one-piece body for commercial vehicles and family station wagons. Or between the car and other categories of objects according to a definite kind of line volumes, which is not without influence on clothing. Sharp angles or rounded and loose shapes trend towards large or small sizes. This aesthetics of created objects, giving them the semblance of a product of an era or civilization, is more a semantics than an aesthetic. It manifests itself simultaneously across a large number of categories of production, and already lays deeper than simple external display. It registers and incorporates in objects a certain mode of communication between humans and things by exploring at each instant the most recent possibilities, as though humans must find in each object an opportunity of exploring the effect of the most recent discoveries, thereby participating to the extent they can in the whole field of contemporary activity in accordance with a norm of presentness. Here we leave the layer of the external display of technical reality in order to shift to the intermediary layer of communication with the user, which is discontinuous, more reserved, and partially addressed to the connoisseur.
Yeah, we can stop here. Thanks. Right. So this here he's contrasting the sort of continuity that is characteristic of technical objects in the proper sense of the term. This, which is similar to the continuity of artistic objects that we were just talking about earlier. This kind of continuity is distinct from the sort of continuity that develops from the adaptation of technical objects to the human user. And so this is a point, or this is related to a point that he makes on the mode of existence of technical objects. He talks about how cars, for example, have all sorts of accommodations for the comfort of the user, or the supposed comfort of the user. You can think of things like power steering, power windows, heated seats, all this type of stuff. All these things are meant to make the object seem sort of modern and convenient and comfortable, and all these sort of adjectives that we would apply to an object, but they don't actually affect, or they don't sort of fundamentally affect the functioning of the car as a vehicle. And so Simondon points out that if you try to classify technical objects in terms of their use, then you end up sort of missing the fundamental connections. And so there might be more connection between a car of a certain era and a boat, for example, because of the structure of the motor. They might have the same sort of structure of motor compared to a car from one era to the car of a subsequent era. Even if the use of the cars in the two eras is the same, they might have a completely different, or a very different sort of underlying structure in terms of how the motor is organized. So yeah, by sort of focusing by focusing on the use side of technical objects, you lose sight of the more fundamental structure of these objects. He points out here again that this use or this adaptation of the technical objects to the user is subject to variation, a kind of infinite variation, in the sense that you could have any color, any sort of subtle variations of shape, precisely because this adaptation or this variation is not functional. So the color of the car doesn't affect the speed or the capacity of the car to actually transport people. So because there's no sort of functional restriction on the color of the car, you can take any color that is realizable by the properties of paint and so on. Whereas the actual technical object, the sort of real technical structure, the fundamental technical structure of the car, is something that can only undergo sort of discrete variation as opposed to continuous variation, there are a sort of limited, with a given state of technology at a particular time, there's only limited ways you can actually change that car to make it better. I don't know, the introduction of a new set of metals to make the engine lighter, for example, or something like that. There's only a small amount of variation that actually preserves and enhances the functionality of the vehicle. So yeah, it's this contrast between this sort of unlimited variation of the adaptability of the object on the one hand, and then the much more limited domain of actual technical developments on the other hand.
So in the beginning of this section, he says that the continuity, which is the universality and eternity, is, I guess, he associates this with the internal. It's not the superficial or the intermediate layer, but the internal aspect of the technical object, which seems, at least in the example of photography, to be the resolution of a disparation, which I think is something like the behavior of light and the chemical makeup of the light or whatever is serving as the whatever is going to receive the image. So I guess is the idea here that there's this fundamental disparation which is resolved in the invention of the technical object, and it's that resolution which has the continuity, and the other stuff is just kind of accidental.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the camera example in a couple pages, but yeah, I think the continuity is so there's a continuity and discontinuity at the same time, in the sense, so there's a discontinuity in the sense that there's only a small number of possible technical developments from a given state of technology. So if you have a camera circa 1960, there's only so many things you can actually do to make that camera better. There's only so many possible developments of this camera object that actually enhance its functioning as a camera. So it's discontinuous in that sense. But then the continuity is the fact that the schema of operation, the way that you use light hitting a photosensitive surface of some kind to produce an image, this sort of technical schema is inherited from one stage of technology to the next. So it's continuity in the sense of an inheritance. I think each sort of stage of the technology is going to be its own sort of moment of individuation, in the sense that so it will be a kind of overcoming of a disparation in its own right, but it does so on the basis of an existing technical object that it inherits the structure from. So if you're in 1960 and you're an engineer working for Polaroid or whatever, Kodak or one of these big camera manufacturers, you're not sort of starting from scratch. You're starting on the basis of an existing technical apparatus, that you have the schema of operation of this technical apparatus, and then you can modify it to improve its functioning in some way. And so this is you're inventing something, but at the same time you're inventing it on the basis of an existing technical schema. So it's there's a continuity in inheritance, but a discontinuity in terms of the sort of spectrum of possible developments that is presented to you as the potential inventor. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I can read the next page. This semantics of presentness of what is created was translated in the car of 1925 by the visible use of light alloys or aluminum, whose functional meaning came from aeronautical construction at a time when canvas was replaced by metallic surfaces. At the same time, we find light alloys in medical devices and photographic enlargers, in a vast number of home appliances, and even in furniture, doorknob and handles. The usefulness of the choice of aluminum in small amounts, for example, on the dashboard of a car, is near zero, since the total weight is only infinitesimally lightened. Yet the inclusion of this metal at the key point, the dashboard, enables the automobile to speak, in its communication with the driver, the language of aviation. At that time, because aviation itself was the, quote, pilot, progressing in leaps and bounds, aluminum was a more quote-unquote technical metal than others. In touring cars after World War II, there was a proliferation of minor automatism and controls used in the Navy and Air Force, where masses to be moved exceeded human force, and control panels are required. The use of a material displaying the present does not only reflect within a given techniques the prestige of a triumphant techniques in which the material has functional usefulness. This use also corresponds to the transposition across many domains of a trend that arose in such a general area that it inaugurates lasting training and radiates perceptual and operational norms. The house with large glass surfaces imposed its large, nearly flat windows on the car, comparable to picture windows, and victorious over the aerodynamics of shapes. Like the cupboard integrated into stone walls, the trunk of cars formerly brought from the outside onto the car body is now part of the whole and is undergoing a sustained development. Each created object thus takes part in the contemporary activity of creation according to general modalities, which unify solutions and align them with either a state-of-the-art techniques or with implementations whose constant use imposes common norms on a whole population, for instance in modern housing. This communication among the middle layers of the created object causes there to be at each moment not only parallel sets of created objects distributed across categories of use, but a world of created objects, of creation. Nonetheless, in both the external and middle layers, we are dealing only with an organization of extrinsic compatibility, comparable to the rules of a language tending to become a coined. Conversely, the organization of the internal and properly technical layer makes the created object into a real invention, formalizing it concretely by giving it the features of an organism through the search for conditions of intrinsic compatibility. We no longer deal here with an active display nor with a semantic relation to the universe of techniques and its progression, but with a direct and immediate adequation between the act of invention and the created object. The created object is in its very essence a reality instituted by the invention. This essence is primordial and may exist without display and without expression. Let's stop here. He's talked about this superficial layer, so the color of the car, some slight variations on the shape and so on. And then next, now he's going on to the middle layer. So here, there's again a sort of communicative function of these aspects of the vehicle, for example. So he talks about using aluminum on the dashboard of a car. So this, from a functional point of view, this has relatively little effect on the car. The dashboard is a very small part of the weight of the car, so using lightweight metals doesn't really affect the car, as it functions. So in this sense, it has a decorative role similar to the superficial aspects like the color of the car. But at the same time, it's drawn the sort of communicative function of the aluminum dashboard is drawn from another technical realm where it does have a functional role. So in the case of the car, the aluminum dashboard in the car, it's the realm of aeronautics. So on an airplane, building things out of aluminum actually does have a functional role because saving weight is a very important function in the design of an airplane. So it's the communicative function of the aluminum dashboard is sort of borrowing the technical value of another domain. So you're by having an aluminum dashboard, you're communicating the fact that your car is modern and uses all the technical developments of aeronautics for the purpose of the modernity and sophistication of this car. Even though, of course, the actual contribution that this aluminum dashboard makes to the functioning of the car is minimal, it's the communication of this borrowed technical sophistication that is sort of characteristic of this middle layer. So you can think of I think maybe a more contemporary example would be like smart devices. The way that so many devices that you can buy today, you can connect your fridge to the internet, for example, and have it tell you you can check your fridge from work and see if your stock of milk is low or whatever. So this idea that the high-tech sphere of computers and the internet is sort of incorporated into your home appliances is sort of borrowing one sphere's technical developments and inserting them into another, primarily for a communicative function. There might be some advantages to having your fridge connected to the internet, but I think the main function is to communicate how sophisticated your device is. And again, like cars have incorporated all sorts of computer functions now. That you have sensors and cameras and all this built into a car, which again has a certain functional role in it might make it easier to park your car if you have a camera for like a backup camera, but it also plays this communicative function of showing that your car is very modern. Yeah, a hackable refrigerator. Obviously, there's a whole like the advantages of your that you get from having your fridge connected to the internet also come with a lot of disadvantages in the sense that your device is now accessible to not just you as the owner of the house or owner of the fridge, but potentially other people. If you can access it over the internet, then that means other people can potentially access it if they can get around whatever security precautions you've taken. And many of these devices have very limited security sort of setups. So yeah, having every appliance in your house connected to the internet means that all of that information is now sort of potentially accessible. So there's probably good reasons to not want your technical appliances in your house to be connected to the internet. So yeah, whether the advantages of your smart fridge and smart dishwasher and all this outweigh the potential risks of having all that information available online. I'm not convinced, but apparently some people are because people buy these things. But again, it's a big part of the value of this smart appliance is precisely the fact that it communicates that the user is high tech and sophisticated and has the money to buy this cutting edge fridge or more cutting edge dishwasher, as opposed to whatever functional advantage you actually get from having your fridge connected to the internet. So again, so just before we go on to the next bit, so I wanted to sort of emphasize the contrast, or to re-explain the contrast between the superficial layer and the intermediate layer that Simondon has set out here. So the superficial layer has to do purely with the adaptation to the user, in the sense that it doesn't sort of rely on any technical functioning. So again, you can think of the color of your car, some variations of shape and so on. This is like a purely aesthetic, in the sense, like aesthetic, not even in the sense of like artistic production, but just in terms of like a sort of pure impression of like this color looks cool or something like that. So yeah, this is the superficial layer, and then the intermediate layer is still primarily has a communicative function. It's sort of a car with a certain type of this aluminum dashboard, for example. It conveys a message about the user, about the owner of the car. It says this person is sophisticated and high tech and so on. But it does so by borrowing from another technical sphere where there is a functional value to the aluminum construction. So by it's not a purely aesthetic function, in the sense that aluminum doesn't sort of look nicer than other materials, or at least arguably. I don't think most people would say aluminum is like a particularly like intrinsically aesthetically pleasing material. It's just a sort of gray metal kind of color. But it's the fact that there's this association with the airplane. It's this sort of borrowing of the technical function from another sphere that makes this aluminum dashboard into something that has a communicative function and that conveys the high tech nature of the device. So yeah, it's I guess this like intrinsic aesthetic value that sort of adapts the object to the user in the case of the superficial layer, and then it's this extrinsic value of borrowing the technical functioning from another domain that characterizes this intermediate level. Yeah, and so Angus has posted a picture of a race car with an aluminum dashboard. Yeah, it does look fast, and everything's red too. Red is the fast color. Yeah, it's I mean, maybe in the case of a race car, it might actually be technically useful. Like, again, race cars, you need to reduce the weight. But yeah, I'm not sure, with the like technical possibilities that were available whenever this car was made. I don't know if aluminum was like the best material for combining weight and strength, or if there were other materials that might have been better. But the aluminum sort of conveys the message of like speed and sophistication in a way that other materials might not have.
I can read the next page or so. Are we at the display?
Yes. So yeah, you can read. Yeah, we still have several pages in this subsection. So just read a page.
Okay. The display, external layer, and the expression, the middle layer, could not exist if they were not supported by the internal layer, the nexus of productive and resistant technicity, upon which the external and middle layers develop like parasites, with an importance that varies in accordance with social and psychosocial circumstances. Situations of danger, of extreme difficulty or war perform a purge of the inessential, letting the invented object emerge in its essential state. The primitive version of an invention is also quote-unquote wilder than its later version for mass distribution. The reaction of external layers back onto the invented object can, in certain cases, occasion a regression, as has happened recently in the domain of photography, where we see a generalized use of cameras whose optical attributes are very much below the actual possibilities of production, but which are endowed as a counterpart with a few rather limited automatisms that avoid gross errors and exposure time and give access without training to the use of photography by a wider public knowing nothing of optics and photometry. By moving far afield of the place and time of the invention, the technical object may also undergo a split along the various layers, differently inflected according to use and social strata. Thus, photography first developed among knowledgeable amateurs and professionals who not only knew how to use a camera correctly, but also how to develop and print sensitive elements. The first split occurred when the vast majority of amateurs left it to artisans to develop and print their films. This is when the camera for the amateur became a camera with a roll of film, easy to transport and ship, while the professional camera retained the sensitive plate on a glass or plate film. The third dichotomy took place with the launching of industrial development and printing, which no longer allowed the control or adaptation of each snapshot to variations of exposure time, especially for color pictures whose error tolerance is very small. It is to this industrialization that cameras with closed cartridges correspond, with very rudimentary optics and automatic settings of the diaphragm aperture and no distance focus. The old amateur camera has not disappeared, but has become specialized and perfected for photojournalism. These two successive dichotomies produced a tripartite split at the end of which we find, first, at the purely technical layer, a camera chamber equipped with film plates for scientific, geographical, and professional photography. The middle layer, corresponding to the predominance of expression, is concretized in photojournalist cameras with a wide set of optical and photometric settings. Finally, the external layer of display is expressed in the wide dissemination of simplified but automated enclosed cameras. We should note that this tripartite split corresponds to clearly separated functions in the uses of photography by various operators. A camera is in the hands of someone whose essential function at the moment of operating is to take a photograph. The photojournalist camera belongs to a journalist taking photographs for an investigation or during travel. The photograph has a professional value, but it is auxiliary. Finally, the down market cameras correspond to a leisure function of which they are a manifestation, and to which they are negatively adapted by virtue of their automatisms not having a sufficient extension to be applied to conditions outside of bright daylight and subjects located a few yards from the operator. Trying to understand how the technical camera chamber, what he has in mind for after this tripartite split, like what is the camera that represents this pure camera chamber with film plates, as opposed to the middle layer, which is the photojournalist camera. But I guess I understand the broader point, which is that there's this core technical function which can become distorted by these kind of user interface or what he calls automatisms of aspects of the technical object that are not available to non-experts, basically.
Yeah, I think the sort of pure instance or the purer instance here is what he's calling the scientific camera. So it's like so this is the one where you still have the glass plate, for example. So here in a scientific, so again, I'm not like that familiar with the state of photography circa 1960, so I'm sort of taking what he says as valid. But the scientific camera, so if you're taking a picture of a scientific specimen or you're doing a geographical survey or something like that, the whole purpose of your picture is to get as good, as much resolution as possible, as accurate a representation of the image of the object being photographed as possible. So here you need to have, as good photographic properties as possible, and so that requires adjustability of the mechanism for different exposure lengths, different lens distances, and so on. Everything has to be adjustable, and that means that to operate this kind of camera, you have to actually know what you're doing in terms of optics and exposure times and all this stuff. So this is like the pure end of the spectrum, where the technical functioning of a camera is at most exposed to the user, and there's a minimum of sort of adaptation to the user. The next one up is the photojournalist's camera, where here the camera has to be usable in a wide variety of settings. So a photojournalist might be taking pictures of all kinds of different scenes, different lighting situations, etc. So there has to be an adaptability. But the purpose of the photo is not so much to accurately convey the dimensions and shape, etc., of an object, but to convey a kind of meaning of a scene. So you can to some extent mask the different adaptation settings. So you can have, like, instead of having a continuously variable exposure and lens distance, you could have, like, say 10 settings that you can choose from. So you still have to have some sort of understanding of how the light conditions relate to the camera settings, for example. So it still requires a certain amount of knowledge, but it's less than for the purely technical camera, the scientific camera. And then the sort of extreme end of the spectrum is the tourist camera. It's designed just for taking pictures of your family, from a few meters away, under normal lighting conditions outside. So it has a minimum of options in terms of changing the settings. It essentially just does one thing, moderately well without producing errors. And so most of the possibilities for the exposure time and lens distance and all that stuff are all sort of preset, and there's nothing that you as the user need to know how to do. So here we have these three layers of the technical object are all sort of split into different technical objects that each have an emphasis on one of those layers. And so this is maybe like an extreme case, like in the case of cameras, but for other technical objects, it might not be quite as clear which layer is predominant in a particular technical object. There might be like technical objects that have some aspects that are more purely technical and other aspects that are more intermediate, and then further aspects that are sort of superficial. So yeah, there's like this is like a pure case where each of these functions is separated out into a different technical object, whereas in other spheres of technical development, there might be objects that combine these different layers into one technical object.
It's interesting to me that he seems to he describes the effect of the superficial and intermediate layers on the internal technical layer in kind of strong, like moralistic or ethical terms, like he calls them parasites on the internal technical layer, and he does really seem to think that they tend to get in the way, or at least they can get in the way, and they do in the instance of the camera, of the essential function. It also seems like the user interface layers get in the way by handling for the user the actions that the expert or the artisan would know, the connoisseur would know how to carry out themselves. So it's because the machine or the technical object handles these actions for the user that these automatisms get in the way of the essential technical function.
Yeah, that's another bit that I didn't mention my summary there. That so Simon Doan talks about this feedback effect of the intermediate and superficial layers onto the technical layer. So what he means by that is that, or at least in the case of the camera, the technical layer has like an openness to it. It has this range of variation. So the scientific camera allows for a wide variety of light exposure settings and lens aperture and all this stuff. Everything about the camera is adjustable so that you can get the precise required settings to capture the object as perfectly as possible. And then what the intermediary and superficial layers do, so this adaptation to the user sort of cuts down the amount of variation successively at each level of the technical development. So the photojournalist camera has a few settings, but has much fewer options for variability compared to the scientific camera. And then the camera for the masses has essentially no variation, no options in terms of what settings you can use. So it cuts back on the technical capacities of the object. So the kinds of pictures that you could take that are available in terms of the technical capacities of the 1960s, these capacities are sort of restricted in such a way that the camera can take a decent picture under average circumstances, as opposed to a perfect picture under a wide variety of circumstances. So it's feeding back onto the technical apparatus, onto the technical level by restricting the possibilities to a small subset of what would be technically possible. This I think is this is what he means by this feedback. And so we can see, you're right that Simon Doan uses these kind of value-laden terms to describe it. Yeah, like a parasite. It's a very strong term. But I think for Simon Doan, there's a kind of ethics of technical objects in the sense that we should try to appreciate technical objects in terms of their actual functioning. And so this is like grasping the essentials of an object, whereas treating a technical object purely in terms of the usefulness for meeting certain human needs is kind of a superficial appreciation of the object. It doesn't really grasp the object as a in its own sort of in its own right. It doesn't grasp the essence of the object. There's an ethics of the technical object. He even, I think, in one of his interviews, he talks about the importance of repairing old technical objects and appreciating the way that an old object still works. Even if it's not like the most modern, it doesn't have like all the fancy decorations, and it's not connected to the internet, for example. It still works, and you can still appreciate it for the functioning that it has as a technical object. I think for him, not valuing the technical object for its technical functioning, this intrinsic functioning of the technical object, means a kind of neglect of that technical object, which is a kind of ethical lack, you're not sort of fulfilling your obligations towards that technical essence of the object. Yeah, I think that's a good example in another sphere. So yeah, you can talk about like if you like all you read of Shakespeare is like some like Cole's notes or whatever, you have sort of missed the point of reading Shakespeare. You've like you might have like some superficial understanding of the plot of various plays. You might like have some familiarity with some important lines or whatever, but you won't really get the experience of appreciating a Shakespeare play on your own and grasping the essence of that aesthetic production. And so I think it's the same type of thing here with a technical object where learning to use the technical object that doesn't sort of accommodate to the user. So grasping the technical object in its actual functioning, and all the range of possibilities that are available that you have to learn how to use. This is a kind of first-hand experience of the technical object, whereas using the type of camera that has only one setting that sort of produces decent pictures most of the time. This type of encounter with a technical object is a kind of second-hand encounter. You're only getting a small slice of the technical possibilities that the designers of this object have sort of pre-chosen for you. I think, though, maybe to counter that, of course, and this is even more the case today than it was in 1960. You can't be an expert in every single technical object that is available on the market. You as a person who lives in a society with many thousands of technical objects available, you can become an expert in how to use cameras, for example, and buy a camera that allows you to adjust the light settings and the lens and all this. You can be an expert in a camera, but you can't at the same time be an expert in cars and airplanes and like every single technical object. You have to you can become an expert in a few technical objects, but not in every single technical object. Someone like Simondon had a wide knowledge of technical matters in general. He had a lot of familiarity with how these objects work. He obviously was not an expert in every single technical object that existed in 1960, and there are many more technical objects now, and many of them are much more sophisticated than the ones that were available in 1960. So again, you can't be an expert in everything. So this sort of ideal of having a first-hand knowledge of every technical object is unrealizable, and so I think we probably need some sort of understanding of the ethics of technical objects that sort of accounts for the fact that we can't understand everything in all this detail, and in some respects, it is necessary to rely on the designers of objects to sort of pre-select. It's probably not that ethically important that you use a microwave that allows you to adjust every single setting as opposed to just pressing the on button. Maybe there's some value in understanding the functioning of the microwave, but like there's also value in not having to care how the microwave works and just using it to heat your food and do something else and save the time. I think an ethics of technical objects would have to take account for this sort of value of selective attention as well. Okay, I think we have time for probably one more selection, one more passage. So 61, if you would like to read another page.
Oh, I got sidetracked. Where are we?
We are on page 168 at the technical object as a product of invention.
Okay, got it. The technical object as a product of invention is characterized in an essential way by its organic character, which we might equally call a structural and functional self-correlation, as opposed to the divergence of adaptive evolution that specializes the product according to categories of users. In particular, in our chosen example, the foundation of photography as an invention should not be sought only in the camera, but in the compatibility of a photosensitive surface with the reduction of the camera obscura in a photographic camera. Camera obscuras and photochemicals such as the bitumen of Judea were known before the invention of photography. The invention consisted in putting light to work, directly and automatically, on a photosensitive substance inside a small camera obscura, forming an actual image of object. The various successive improvements brought about more perfect conditions of compatibility between the photochemical phenomenon and the phenomenon of physical optics, especially through the discovery of a compound that retained its sensitivity for a long time after its fabrication, which also preserved, without alteration and until it was developed, the effect of light after exposure in the form of a latent image. The compatibility resides in the suspension of the chemical activity of the sensitive compound between fabrication and development, enabling the taking of the shot to be inserted within this temporal interval. To recall again the diverging specializations which follow the different layers, we can see that the use which gives priority to the most essential layer is also that which maintains the highest degree of compatibility between optical and chemical processes. With a professional camera using glass or film plates, and even with the most advanced photojournalistic cameras, each shot can be developed by itself. The Polaroid system, which features development and printing a few seconds or dozens of seconds after the snapshot, brings about a temporal and local compatibility between both processes whose interaction constitutes photography as an invention. Moreover, the system implements a camera comparable to a professional photographic camera, at least with reference to the large format and the apparatus of the bellows. The Polaroid camera, rather than extending the divergent use which separates the display and expression aspects of the fundamental photographic apparatus, brings this diverging bundle together into a single unit, covering the whole spectrum of possible uses, from professional to leisure uses, including photojournalism and related application, like the distribution of actors before a cinematographic take, through the retroaction of photographs on the actors' poses. This new wave of invention in the domain of photography increases the compatibility between physical and chemical processes to such a point that it makes possible retroaction within the snapshot itself, a first photograph being used to improve framing, composition of subject matter, and optical settings for the next photograph. Certainly, the invention of the Polaroid apparatus is the result of very advanced industrialization, yet according to a common effect in technological matters, this true invention, bearing on the essential and constituting a major progress, restores some aspects of the activity of amateurs, in particular the extreme decentralization of the activity of operation, and a complete operative independence in relation to a centralized industrial universe. To the same extent, crossing the threshold of an essential improvement enables the reconvergence as a base unit of the various branches of an initially single technics, branches which minor advances in social and economic adaptation had superficially differentiated.
Yeah, we can stop here. The next paragraph is one of his famous multi-page paragraphs, so let's not embark on that journey just yet. It's interesting here that he looks at the Polaroid camera. So you might think that a Polaroid camera would be something that would fit under the intermediate or superficial categories. So it's a camera that's obviously marketed to users as more convenient. That you take a picture and then you get the print within a few seconds. But at the same time, it allows for again this convergence of the two streams of technical thought that or the two technical schemas that have to be combined to form a camera. So there's the optical stream, so the perfection of lenses and so on, and then there's the photosensitive chemical stream that has to. And then these two things have to be combined to form what we recognize now as a camera. And so he points out that, for example, with a Polaroid camera, you can do something like you can set up a scene and take a picture and then look at the print within a few seconds and see, okay, the lighting is slightly off or the composition is not what I wanted, and you can adjust things and retake it. So you can perfect the functioning of a camera. You can get all the settings adjusted properly through a sort of iterative process. And so instead of having to sort of get everything perfectly right at once and then ship off the film, and then a few weeks later you see, oh, actually it wasn't exactly what I wanted. Now you can, sort of shorten that loop and perform this first composition, and then take the picture, examine the composition, and see, what you can improve, you can do that all within a few minutes. So this actually allows to improve the functioning of a camera in terms of this convergence of the optical and the photosynthetic series. And then at the same time, it also allows the amateur photographer to have a greater control over the process, where previously you had to send off your film to a company that would develop it. Now you can do the development in your own home or in your own studio or whatever. You're sort of separated, or you're not separated, but you're autonomous from the whole industrial system of the film development process. So yeah, it makes the amateur more independent in that way as well. When you're talking about this convergence of these two series, the optical series and the photosensitive chemical series, it makes me think of at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford that I visited last spring. They had an exhibition on an early photographer whose name I can't remember, but he used some sort of silver compound. I forget exactly what it was, but it actually has the property that so it's photosensitive, but it doesn't get fixed in the first exposure. So it means that the photos or the prints that you produce with this substance are still sensitive to light even after the initial exposure. And so it makes it very difficult to preserve these early photographs, because every time you expose them to light at all, they change slightly. Yeah, the exhibition, they showed them, but it was in a very low light room. But even that is still, slightly changing the structure of the patterns on the photosensitive surface. So it's this separation between the photosensitive surface and the print that appears in later photography that allows for the production of something that is no longer photosensitive. So you capture the image using a photosensitive substance, and then you print it onto something that is not photosensitive or much less photosensitive, and then the image that you have produced in the print, you can use, put up on posters or whatever. You can allow it to be exposed to light without changing the image in the way that these other sort of early prints or early photographic processes subsequently underwent that deterioration.
The distinction between the different layers in terms of use, you must mean that the user interface of the superficial and intermediate layer is dependent upon the initial technical layer, because here, this initial resolution of the two series is itself even the most technical scientific camera is something that is being used by somebody to take a photo. So it seems like the difference is less the fact that it is being used by somebody using the object than it is that the use is more or less dependent on another use, or I guess for the essential technical layer, it's not dependent on anything else at all other than being used by the user.
Yeah, so you're right. Yeah, definitely every technical object is used by someone. So there has to be a minimum of adaptation in the sense that it has to be physically possible to turn on the device. It has to be, using the device has to be the device has to be shielded in such a way that it's not physically dangerous to hold it or turn it on or whatever. So there's sort of a minimum adaptation to a human user that is required. But I think the difference here is the direction of the overall adaptation. So is it the device that has to be adapted to the user? So in the case of the camera for tourism, it's the device. The technical possibilities of the device are restricted so that you can take a decent image under normal lighting without any sort of adjustment. So the technical possibilities are restricted to allow a user who has no interest in or no knowledge of these technical possibilities to use the device. Or conversely, with the scientific camera, it's the user who has to adapt to the technical device. So the user has to actually learn, undergo a process of transformation of some kind. It could be more or less intensive depending on what kind of technical device it is, but has to adapt themselves to the technical object, has to learn how to use it in such a way that they can produce the results that they want. So it's not so much, so yeah, of course, every technical object has a user, but the question is whether it's the user that has to adapt to the technical object or the technical object that has to adapt to the user. So yeah, I think it's this direction of adaptation that is what makes the distinction between the two.
I think I just understood. I think it was in the beginning, towards the beginning of Individuation Volume 2, where he had that mysterious reference to surrealist artworks. But I was just looking at my notes, and I think that the reason he likened the technical object to the surrealist object is because the surrealist object is not useful. And I wonder if this is the kind of I don't know if he thinks of the internal technical layer as like a surrealist object, in that, as you said, it has to be conformed to rather than conforming itself to the person who encounters the surrealist object in order to make it a kind of pleasant and sensible encounter and experience.
Yeah, I don't remember that passage, but that sounds that sounds interesting in terms of a connection. I think we can think of like not just surrealist, but I guess art from the sort of mid 20th century onwards, where the pursuit of beauty in a more sort of traditional sense is less and less the focus of art. If you go to a contemporary art exhibit at a museum today, many of the objects are not going to be beautiful in any sort of standard sense. Whereas if you go to an exhibit of even early 20th century impressionists or something like that, the objects, the paintings are beautiful in some sense. So these objects that we find in contemporary art, they at least in terms of their intention, they're meant to produce an effect on the user, on the viewer, that requires the viewer to learn to understand them and to grasp what they're doing. You don't have whereas a sort of classical sculpture, you just sort of see the beauty of the form. It's something that you kind of, not quite passively, but you don't need to learn to appreciate like Renaissance sculptures. You can already see the sort of aesthetic value of them without really learning anything about art. But then for more contemporary art, you have to actually sort of learn to appreciate what it is that the artist is doing, rather than having this sort of immediate experience of beauty. So yeah, I think this is a similar type of phenomenon where, like the technical object that you have to learn how to use, the artwork in more contemporary art is something that you have to learn how to grasp and how to experience. It's not something that you have like a sort of immediate understanding of. And you can see with this also like the way that aesthetic categories change. Like people like the Impressionists, for example, when they first started painting and exhibiting in the late 19th century, they were treated as like their work was treated as being like sort of amateur and like not like the people who saw it or many of the art critics who looked at it in the early days saw it as they had a similar kind of experience of like, what is this? Like, this is not good art. This is not what I recognize as beautiful. Whereas today, of course, these paintings sell for many millions of dollars. People travel around the world and visit museums where they're exhibited. So the sort of aesthetic experience categories that we bring to understanding paintings have changed over the last 100 years or so. So maybe one day these weird sort of contemporary art things that are made out of garbage or whatever, it's something like this, maybe someone 100 years from now will have like similar experience of this is just beautiful in the way that we experience impressionist art. The other thing I was going to mention, it's somewhat tangential to the main point of this passage, but when he talks about Polaroid here, it reminds me, I was just reading last couple of weeks an article about there was a boycott campaign against Polaroid in the 1970s because Polaroid had this camera, I think it was the D1, if I remember correctly, was the name of it. So the sort of purpose of this camera was that you could produce ID cards very quickly. Like you take a picture, and then the camera would print not like a normal photograph, but an ID card. And this was used by apartheid South Africa to produce passes that all Black people had to bring with them at all times. That the police would check and so on. And at one point, Polaroid stopped selling directly to South Africa, but they would sell to third-party distributors who would in turn sell it to the South African police. So anyway, there was this boycott campaign against Polaroid, and so the article I was reading about this pointed out that this camera had a boost setting, so it would boost the light exposure by like 43% or something like that of the light in the flash. And this turns out to be like pretty much the exact quantity that you need to take a picture to adjust the light settings for a white subject to a Black subject. Darker skin requires more light to get an adequate picture. So you just press this boost button, and then you can take a picture of a Black person with adequate light. And so Polaroid, denied that this was didn't say that this was designed for apartheid South Africa's police uses, but it just happened to fit exactly what they needed. So yeah, that's why there was this boycott campaign against Polaroid at the time. So yeah, these technical developments also have a political aspect to them that Simon Doan doesn't really address, I think, but that are also interesting to look at.
That's interesting. It's a pretty egregious example. Literally a discrimination button on your camera.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I think we're about at the 2-hour mark, so we should stop here. So this is a very long subsection. Yeah, it takes us all the way to 178, so we probably won't finish the subsection next time, but we'll continue from the bottom of 169 next time. And then we will see how far we get. I think next week I should be there's no obstacle for next week, so we should be back to our regular schedule.
That sounds good. Talk to you both next week. Thanks, Don. Thanks, 61.
Yeah, thanks both of you. See you next week.